Should we start? Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Andrea Simari Rosenberg. I've worked at Mercy Home for 3 years after being a teacher for 4 years at an elementary school on the south side of Chicago. I'm really happy you could join us today for our webinar on engaging students who have been impacted by trauma and adversity. This is my coworker, Liz Tomka, who will be starting us off here.
Hi everyone, as Andrea mentioned, my name is Liz. I have worked at Mercy Home for 7 years. I am a licensed clinical social worker with a background in school social work, and I have experience as a school social worker for 5 years in a charter high school in Chicago. So we are bringing our past school experience as well as our experience at Mercy Home to our webinar today. So we're going to go off camera and you'll hear us throughout the broadcast. Thanks again for joining. All right, so a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. You have joined in listen-only mode, so if you want to communicate to us, that should be through chat. So there is a control panel on your screen, and you should be able to chat with us through that. And we will be utilizing a poll as well as opportunity to raise your hand throughout the webinar. So let's give that a try. If you can hear me loud and clear, can you go ahead and raise your hand? All right. Seems that we've got pretty good response on that. All right. So we have our topic for today, which is engaging students who have been impacted by trauma and adversity. And as you know, this is hosted by Mercy Home. So for those of you who are not familiar with Mercy Home, we want to provide an introduction for you. So we are located in Chicago. It was established 130 years ago as an orphanage for homeless boys. And as you can imagine, over time, orphanages and child protective services have changed quite a bit. So today, Mercy Home is a residential treatment facility. We have 2 campuses, one for boys and one for girls, and we serve 134 youth when we are at capacity. We provide academic and career supports. That is the department that Andrea and I work in, and we also provide the residential support, as you know, and that is through our Mercy model of care. So that includes milieu, individual, group, and family therapy, and this is based on a treatment model, which we call our Mercy model of care, which we will describe in detail later. We serve both boys and girls ages 11 through 21. Youth go through an admissions process when they come to Mercy Home, and they have to voluntarily commit to Mercy Home's treatment program and have to be motivated to engage in treatment. Now, that is not to say that they love being here every day. We certainly challenge them to reach their goals, and they commit to doing really challenging stuff when they're here. But at the start, they need to voluntarily, commit to and be motivated to come here. Typical youth who come here would benefit from building healthy attachments and relationships. Everything we do here at Mercy Home is based on relationships. Youth oftentimes have experience trauma and neglect, oftentimes both of those, and we will talk about types of trauma later. And youth are oftentimes having difficulty coping with the stressors that they're experiencing in their lives. Youth present with moderate emotional, behavioral, and psychological challenges. So when you think about the spectrum of residential programs, we serve those who have some moderate challenges. So beyond those emotional, behavioral, and psychological challenges, we have kids who come to us with a lot of academic challenges. That could be, educationally and or vocationally. A typical youth who comes to us is 3 to 4 years behind with their math and reading skills. That's the average, so keep that in mind. We have some kids who are, are above grade level. We have some kids who are even further behind with their math and reading skills. And last, the kids are coming to us because they would benefit from being temporarily removed from their home setting. We do not take guardianship over the kids, and it's really important that we are partnering with their families so that the eventual goal is that they can return home to live with their families. That is the ultimate goal. For kids who come to us who are like 17, 18, up through 21, when they begin in our care, their goal is going to be independence. So we are preparing them for independence. So we want to talk a little bit about our work with the schools at Mercy Home. We have a team of people that work in the academy, which is the department that Andrea and I work on, and we have our Mercy Model in Schools team. So we train educators like you how to recognize signs of trauma in students and provide trauma-informed care in your classrooms and responding to student behavior. So we are a few years into this, and to date we have offered training on site at schools, here at Mercy Home, and through webinars. So we did our first webinar last April. It's actually the same content that we are doing today, and we had such a great response from it that we decided to kick off this school year with the same content as of last April's webinar, but to do 3 more throughout the year. So we will keep you on our email list now that you are on our list for being a part of this webinar today, so that you can find out about those in the future. One in December will focus on routines and rituals in the classroom and in the school. February will focus on affect management and self-care, and April will focus on effective responses. We do have a couple of in-person opportunities that are upcoming. Andrea and I both work at our Hey Boys campus, which is located in the West Loop of Chicago. And on Thursday, October 12th, we are hosting an educators evening. It's an opportunity to learn more about the admissions process, to get tours of Mercy Home. People often wonder what a residential home looks like, so you can see that in person for yourself. And then Andrea and I will be co-presenting that night on aspects of the Mercy model in schools, but on a different topic from today. And then on Thursday, October 26th, our Walsh Girls Campus, which is located in the Beverly Morgan Park community, the academy staff at that campus will be presenting also an opportunity to see the girls' homes. We do have some overlap with the schools that we work with for both our boys and our girls, but there are some, different ones that we work with, so we want to have the opportunity for educators to see both campuses if they would like. So future registration for webinars will be available through our website, mercyhome.org/mercymodelinschools. We also have opportunity to register for our Hey Boys Campus open house at that website as well. Lastly, we have other information posted on that site, so I encourage you to check it out. Okay, so jumping into our webinar, our objectives for today are as advertised, so hopefully this is not a surprise to you. We are going to talk about the impact of trauma on the brain and learning. We'll then talk about strategies to engage students in the classroom, talk about effective responses to students' behaviors, and then we want to be able to provide additional resources so that you can become a trauma-informed school. So first, defining trauma. Trauma or traumatic events are overwhelming, uncontrollable experiences that impact victims psychologically, and oftentimes creating feelings of helplessness, vulnerability, loss of safety, and loss of control. So oftentimes when we think about trauma, we think about a singular event. And today we are going to talk about complex developmental trauma, and vicarious trauma. And you do have handouts that have been shared with you. You can access those through your control panel that talk more about acute, chronic, and system-induced trauma. But as I mentioned, I'm going to focus more on complex developmental trauma and vicarious trauma. So complex developmental trauma are the multiple and chronic and prolonged experiences of trauma. So we often think of those in the context of the caregiving system. The caregiving system has an impact on the experiences of trauma that kids are experiencing. And these are often intergenerational as well. So we here at Mercy Home, we work directly with kids and their families, and it's really important that we understand their family history and better understand the backgrounds that their parents have had, because many of them have also had experiences of trauma. So that includes experiences of abuse, neglect, violence, and disrupted attachments. And with violence, that can be domestic violence, victims of war, certainly big in our news, current events, those who've experienced natural disasters have really uprooted things. But here in Chicago especially, I think it's important to recognize community violence and the impact that that can have on kids. I know for our educators here in Chicago, you can probably relate to that as well. So I want to talk a little bit about vicarious trauma, which is oftentimes a form of trauma that isn't talked about, but one that is really important for teachers to learn about, and one that hopefully, if we have any social workers or counselors on the webinar today, hopefully you are already aware of vicarious trauma. So the American Counseling Association defines vicarious trauma as the emotional residue of the exposure that counselors have from working with people as they're learning and hearing about their trauma stories and becoming witnesses to the survivors. So it's really important to recognize that counselors, teachers, and school staff can all be impacted by students' trauma. And we need to think of ourselves as caregivers. When we talk a little bit more later about our Mercy model of care, we're going to talk about all adults in our students' lives as caregivers. So it's really important that we can give good care to our students as caregivers. So a little bit about my own experience. When I worked in a charter high school, I worked in a really high needs community, one that was under-resourced, one that had a really high rate of poverty as well as really high rate of violence, and worked with students with complex developmental trauma. And over time, I really was impacted by working with students who were impacted by trauma. And it took me a few years to learn, and I think I'm always still learning about self-care, but it's so important that we take care of ourselves as adults so that we can give the best care that we can to the students that we are working with. So we are going to have our first and only poll question. So now that we've learned a little bit about trauma, we want to have you answer questions about what you have experienced and the students that you work with. Okay, so go ahead and you can yeah, go ahead and select. All right, looks about, we can see the number of participants is increasing, so that's great. Our goal is to try to get 100% of the attendees participating in this poll if possible. We'll give you just a few more seconds. Okay, so it looks like we had 89% of you who voted, so we're going to share the responses with you. Okay, all right, so we have shared it with you. It looks like 100% of you have worked with students who've experienced complex developmental trauma. So looks like we have the right target audience today, and quite a, a large percentage of you, work in neighborhoods with community violence, neighborhoods with high poverty rates, that you have been impacted by your students' trauma experiences, 88% of you, and then 63% of you noted that you have access to resources that your students need. So great, because we want to provide those resources for you and continue to be a resource for you. Okay, so we've talked about trauma. The other part of our webinar is talking about adversity, which is probably a term that you are familiar with. Just dictionary definition, it's an unfavorable or difficult situation or condition. So I'm going to introduce to you a popular study known as the ACE study. It was started in 1995. It is a long-term study that continues. It is conducted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and Kaiser Permanente. And it is all about adverse childhood experiences. So it's looking at the relationship between those experiences and adult health risks, disease, and social functioning throughout the lifespan. The CDC has a really wonderful website with great infographics. I've taken these infographics from there. So a little bit about the different types of adverse childhood experiences that they have studied. There's 10 ACEs. 3 fall into the category of abuse, so that's emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. 2 into the category of neglect, so that's emotional and physical neglect, and the remainders are household challenges. So ones that are, within the house where children are growing up, mother treated violently, so oftentimes it's the mothers who are victims of domestic violence, although it's not singularly women, substance abuse, mental illness, separation and divorce, and then having an incarcerated household member. So when you think about all these ACEs and you think about your students, think of your students who have experienced 3 or more of these. Now, you don't know everything about the houses where your kids grow up, and their families, but I'm sure you can think of some kids who have a lot of ACEs that they've experienced. So thus far, the study has shown that ACEs can have long-lasting effects on their health, behavior, and their life potential. And it's especially the difference maker is 3 or more ACEs have the risk of negative health and well-being outcomes. And where we come in is looking at their life potential. So graduation rates, their academic achievement, and lost time from work. So when you think of the lifespan, we are working with kids earlier on in their lifespan. So at the base of this triangle, this pyramid, we have the adverse childhood experiences. Those can be ongoing throughout childhood. So for those of you who are working with teenagers, adolescents, those can be ongoing. But as we move up this pyramid, up the lifespan, these ACEs impact having a disrupted neurodevelopment, as well as impairing their social, emotional, and cognitive abilities. So what's really important to know about this study is it's ongoing, and they are looking at opportunities for prevention and intervention. And one thing that really makes a difference with ACEs is that a relationship with a significant adult, a positive adult, can make a difference. So as we talk about caregivers, as we talk about the importance of our roles in our students' lives, we can make a difference for those who have experienced ACEs. So now that we have set the stage learning about trauma and adversity, we are going to learn about how that can impact the brain and learning. So many of the obstacles that the Mercy Home kids face at home and at school, and the ones that you are working with as well, are result in deficits in their ability to process information. form trusting and appropriate relationships with adults, self-regulating their emotions, and meaningfully distinguishing between threatening and non-threatening situations. So that's really broad, and we are going to jump into some more detail with each of those. So when it comes to attention and learning, kids who've experienced trauma can have difficulty paying attention, and a lot of that is due to having difficulty distinguishing between relevant and irrelevant information, and also misinterpreting stimuli as traumatic. So when you are teaching a kid in the classroom, you're expecting them to be paying attention to you, but perhaps they've heard a noise out in the hallway that they appear to be distracted by. That is because their brains don't know whether it is a threat to them or not. And so they are easily aroused, and they can then get distracted by what is going on outside of the classroom. So that's one small example. I'm sure that happens many times a day, that there is something distracting for students. And for students who have been impacted by trauma, they have a harder time really zoning out that unimportant information and zoning in on you as the teacher. It can also, trauma can disrupt kids' ability to learn and process verbal information. So when you think about students who have a more difficult time processing verbal information, we may need to do something different for them. And whether those are students who are identified as having a disability or not, making some accommodations for them, or being really intentional about switching up a better learning or communication style can put you in a more favorable position in being able to support them in the classroom. So I have set the stage for better understanding trauma and a little bit of the impact on the brain, and I'm going to turn it over to Andrea. As I do that, as we make that transition, I want to remind you, you have your control panel, the doc on your screen. We do have handouts available there, and we will be answering questions at the end. You can chat those questions to us. We will also be sharing an evaluation at the end, so we'll take time to look at those at the end.
Thanks, Liz. Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea. If you weren't here from the beginning, I was a former third grade teacher, and now I work at Mercy Home for the last few years, and really excited to be on the webinar with you guys, and really excited for my portion because it is the part that is the takeaway. Is now we know this is going on. Our students are affected by ACEs. Some of us have been affected by ACEs. What can we do about it? And I'm here to tell you that there is a lot. So we're going to look first at ARC. This is part of Mercy Model, the Mercy Model of Care. It's kind of one of our main foundational pieces. So this comes out of the Trauma Institute in Boston. It's being used kind of all over the world, and definitely here at Mercy Home. So really there are some core principles and really some things that have to do with mindset. So in order to really understand trauma and really help kids, we have to think about our mindset. And there are really three things here. So really thinking about how trauma shifts the course of healthy development. So there may be kids in your classroom who you think are 16 and they're sophomores in high school, or they're third graders and they're 7 or 8 or 9 years old. But really, sometimes if they've experienced trauma, their brain hasn't caught up with that age that we know them at. The second part is trauma doesn't occur in a vacuum, right? We have a system that goes on here, and part of changing and helping kids is helping them navigate the system. And the last one is, like, a good intervention goes beyond individual therapy, and we know that in schools is that you guys aren't necessarily doing therapy with your kids, but really anything you're doing as a caregiver for the students in your classroom is going to help them. So when we think about the ARC model, with this kind of basement of understanding, we have these three core domains. So the first one is attachment, and this is where the ARC, A-R-C, comes from. Attachment is a safe caregiving system. When I think of attachment, I think of relationships. The second domain is regulation. This is the ability to regulate and tolerate experiences and emotions. So when we see kids in the classroom, sometimes they can't regulate and tolerate those experiences, and they have high and low emotions, and we'll talk about a little bit more what that looks like. And the last one is really the domain of competency, which is how can we teach kids skills? And this, I mean, schools are so good at this part. For schools, we don't always focus on skill building in terms of teaching teachers, because you're doing a lot of this. But at Mercy Home, we do things like helping kids with their self-identity, helping kids organize, executive functions, helping kids manage their time. And that's really an important part of what we're teaching the youth who live at Mercy Home. So this is a visual of the ARC framework. You can see the ARC kind of going up the house there. One thing I didn't talk about is that roof, the trauma experience integration. That's when we really teach kids that trauma is a part of their story, but it's not their whole story, and they're really trying to figure out who they are and how it fits together. So we'll do things like creating timelines and thinking about their whole life. And when I think about trauma integration in the classroom, I think of that like who am I poster that we do all throughout elementary schools, that they get to show their interests and their family members, and very much, you know, that's a part of trauma experience integration. So going back to the bottom of the house here is this attachment domain on the bottom, and these are kind of three there are three blocks, right? And there are blocks throughout this, and these are kind of each part of the work that we do here, right? And so it doesn't go in any order, but in terms of the attachment part, that's just for caregivers. That's just for the teachers, for the staff at Mercy Home, for principals, right? That's the things that you can do. And then the regulation and competency part is really that's what the kids are doing. So if you look, we really have half of the model, right? We have control of almost more than half of the model, and I think that's really empowering for teachers. I wish I knew this when I was a teacher, because I think that it's really just like good teaching. And when we think about the ARC model in practice, I think of those mentor teachers that I had in the classroom, that it's like they have this amazing ability to capture kids' imagination and to talk to them and relate to them. And the ARC model really just gives us the vocabulary to do that, especially if it didn't come naturally. And it certainly didn't come naturally to me, but the ARC model has really helped me. So we're going to continue, and when we think about the ARC model, it's really important to think about some of that psychoeducation. So this is a pretty complex model of the brain. We're not going to use it today because I'm not a neurologist, and so we're choosing Dan Siegel's brain model of the hand. So, and because everyone has a hand. So go ahead and make a fist and imagine this is your brain. Your wrist, that's your brain stem, right? That's where all our vital systems happen. It controls the rest of our body and whatnot. If we're going up, kind of the middle of our hand, that's our limbic system and our cortex. And tucked in there is our thumb, and that's what we like to call, and I've heard this from other people too, is that's our lizard brain. That's where our emotional core is stored. So if we just had our little thumb there, we'd be more animalistic, right? We'd fight, we'd flight, and we'd freeze. We'd just be a little lizard in there. But good thing, because we're humans, we do have our fingers. They're covering up that little lizard brain, and that's our prefrontal cortex. And that's where all of our executive functions come from. So that's our organizing, our planning, our making decisions. All that's in there. So why is this important? It's because when we experience anxiety and stress and fear, our lids flip. So you'll realize that we're losing all of our prefrontal cortex and our cortex. So we're just using our lizard brain when we're experiencing fear and anxiety. And as Liz talked about, some of our kids who have experienced trauma have experienced a lot of fear and anxiety. So this flipped lid mode is common for them. But we all flip our lids. So let's do a little raise hand here. Raise your hand if you have flipped your lid in your classroom. Liz and I are here raising our hands. So let's see who's here. Yeah, we definitely have a few. We all know life's tough. We all experience fear and anxiety, and sometimes classroom teaching can be really frustrating. And sometimes working at Mercy Home can be frustrating. But now that we know that our lids are flipped and that it's our responsibility to try and keep them down when we can. Because when our lids are flipped, remember, we've kind of lost our ability to use our prefrontal cortex. So this means we don't have rational thought, we don't have language, we don't have memory, digestion, your immune systems, and those all-important executive functions. So this means when our lid is flipped, we're not really understanding what's going on around us. If I'm a seventh grader and I'm experiencing fear and anxiety, maybe someone just made fun of me in the classroom, and my teacher comes over to talk to me, I'm not really understanding what they're saying, right? I couldn't make a good choice at the time because I didn't have my executive functions to plan. So what we need to do is we need to soothe our kids back into their rational brain before we start processing with them. So this is kind of what it looks like in all, right? Our kids kind of start with this, with their full brain on, their executive functions and all. Something might happen in the classroom, the teasing, or they might hear a loud noise outside and they might start flipping their lid and then go all the way up. And our youth who have experienced complex developmental trauma, right, are sometimes living in the survival mode, right, where their safety and basic needs aren't being guaranteed, and so they flip their lid to smaller threats. So that's why sometimes our kids are coming into the classroom and they're already upset. We're like, well, the day just started. What happened? Well, sometimes they're living in this mode. I had a youth who I worked with a few years ago, and he did great here at Mercy. He'd bop around. He's kind of really lively. And one day it so happened that I kind of saw him on the train while I was coming to work. And he was very different while he was on the train. And I could tell that his lid was flipped. He was looking around, trying to see what was going on. If there was a sudden movement, he would kind of look over there. We'd call it being hypervigilant. He was living in that state of stress and anxiety, and because that's kind of from his past. He had learned that he needed to look around to make sure he was safe. So this is a really important concept when we think about helping our kids as they go through life in the classroom. So another way to look at it is they have this window of tolerance, and when their lid is flipped, right, they're hyper aroused. They're at the top of the window of tolerance. They're in that fight or flight mode, right, just their lizard brain. And sometimes, though, we have kids who are on the other side or become on the other side. They're kind of stuck off. They're hypo-aroused. They're in that rest and digest stage a little too long. So these are kids who are heads on the table, really look like they have a bag of brick on their backs, kind of slumped over. What we want is kids who are in that calm and engaged zone. We want their full brains on. We need their executive functions. I like to think of this as the zone of proximal development for teachers. Is we want to teach kids within that zone so they can learn. Well, we also want to teach kids in the calm and engaged zone, right? Because if their lid is flipped or if they're hypo-aroused, they're not using their rational brain. They can't make decisions. They can't plan. So it's really important that if we see if kids' lids are flipped, that we soothe them back into that calm and engaged zone. And I know all of you have been teaching, and so you kind of have some tricks in your bag to see, how can we get kids back into that zone. And it can be more complicated for kids with developmental trauma, but it's definitely something we can work on and definitely something we can help you with. And as we go on, I'll have some have some tools for you. So kind of let's put this all together, right? It's we have a youth who in our classroom, and we have a little student here, and his brain, his head is a hand, but he's flipped his lid, right? Someone in back of him has been calling him names, been threatening him, maybe in high school, and it's just really gotten to them, and they flip their lid, right? Or we have the opposite, they're checked out, tired, right? Could be either. Let's go with the threatening one for now. Right? And the teacher, this has been going on all day. He's been talking out of turn all day. The teacher gets a little frustrated, right? But that may appear threatening to the kid, right? You might walk over really quickly. What's wrong? Okay, that's going to appear threatening to a child. So then, ideally what happens is that teacher realizes, oh, this kid's got something going on and I need to figure out what's happening. And so the teacher self-regulates, right? I like to take a few breaths. And they engage them and say like, I wonder what happened, right? And then we have a calm teacher, and they're helping this youth feel engaged. They're soothing them back into their rational brain, and we then ideally have calm teacher helping calm youth engage in skills that then can get to learning. That's what I always like to emphasize with teachers, is because they're like, well, I don't have time for this. I don't have time for that. It's like, well, if you want to teach them and you want them to learn, the students, then we got to get them back into their rational brains. What we don't want to happen is this. We don't want the escalated caregiver approaching the escalated youth, because really then it's two lizard brains in the classroom and all we have is fight, flight, or freeze, and really nothing productive can happen. So go ahead, it looks like most of you put your hands down. Go ahead if you've ever seen a teacher, an escalated teacher, approach an escalated youth, and you've seen what this looks like. Go ahead and raise your hand if you've seen that. All right, definitely seeing some hands come up. Yeah, it happens, and it happens in our classrooms. I'm raising my hand here. It's happened to me. Really, that self-care is really important, keeping our lids down. But now you know, right? You know this isn't productive. So what can we do to approach a student in our calm and rational brain that is going to get them to learn the skills that they need? And sometimes that means not approaching them right away. Sometimes that means taking 10 seconds to take a few deep breaths and then approach them and see what happens. So next we have a kind of a teacher's toolbox here for you. It's coming up. So this is split up into the domains of ARC, that attachment, regulation, and competencies. And we developed this as a team, really thinking about like, okay, what's something quick we can give to teachers that they can take away the next day and do in their classroom? And this doesn't take any prep time. So my favorite, I'll point out my favorite ones, but you should definitely look through them. I've told teachers before, is like, identify that one youth in the classroom, that youth that you would like secretly wish that they didn't come to school the next day, right? I know that that's inside of you, some of us. Like, I've thought it before, is like, they're really challenging and they take a lot of effort, and it would just be easier if they weren't here. Well, if you can identify that student in your classroom or in your work, that is the youth that you need to check in with each and every day. That is the youth that you need to say hello and goodbye to. That check-in is going to start that relationship, and it's going to make it easier for you to continue throughout the day. That's my favorite one for attachment. For regulation, I really like prompt youth for transitions. So anytime we know our kids struggle with change, and so anytime something's going to be changing in the classroom, we need to give them extra prompts. So I might prompt the classroom, okay, in 5 minutes we're going to be transitioning to science. Then I might go over to Billy and say, hey, Billy, in 5 minutes we're going to be transitioning to science, because I know that Billy was maybe distracted and he didn't hear me when I prompted the whole entire class. For competencies, we teach a lot of organizational skills, so I like that one. I also like sharing your own skills and challenges. You know, we've all had challenges in our life, and I think kids think that teachers are perfect, and they don't, you know, they just live in the classroom all the time, but sharing with them what's difficult in your life. You know, are you not feeling well? Are you sick that day? That can really help kids relate to you. So when we look specifically at behaviors, we want to look through it at through a competency lens. So this is kind of some of the foundational stuff I had touched on before, but it's really important that when we see a challenging behavior, we're looking at this as a lack of skill and not ill will. So if we're looking at it as this kid just doesn't want to, they just don't want to do this, they just want to keep acting out, that's kind of as far as we can go. There's really nothing we can do about that if it's about the kid's will. Now, if we look at it as a skill, that this student is acting out, this student is threatening other kids because they don't know how to relate to other students in the classroom, right? We can take that somewhere. We can teach kids how to relate to others. We can teach them relationship skills or how to be social, right? We can teach them that. But if we're looking at it as just purely motivation, there's not much we can do about that. So I want to give a little plug for discipline systems. So I was like putting this in here because really discipline systems need to be twofold. Of course, there are consequences, and consequences can help kids, but really for our kids who have experienced trauma, and really I think all kids, we want to include consequence plus skill development. How can we teach this child the skill they need so it might not happen next time? And might it happen next time? Yeah, but if we keep on teaching them and teach them how to develop those skills, it's going to happen eventually and maybe quicker. So kind of putting this all together, this is what arc in action looks like, right? So you encounter a student and they're upset. I use the example of throwing a desk, right? A student's kind of pushed a desk and they're really upset, and you know what, I just set up all those desks, but I need to get curious and not furious and think about, okay, what's driving this youth's behavior? What might have happened before they pushed the desk? Right, and I need to take that second to think about that. I even might take 10 seconds. Then I need to regulate myself. I need to come back into my window. I need to use my tools. I'm here holding a beanbag in my hand that helps me regulate. I need to take my deep breaths, and I need to regulate myself, and then I need to approach the student, and I need to respond to them instead of reacting. So I'm going to find a way to reconnect with them, remind them that we're in a caring and safe relationship. I'm going to respond to them with my rational brain and think of a rational approach. And we're going to get to that response next. But then I'm going to repair with them after I respond, right? I'm going to bring them back into the classroom. Sometimes it's helpful to isolate a student, right? If they just push to desk and say, hey, come with me, let's talk about this outside of, maybe to the side of the class, and so everyone's not looking. But then I want to reintegrate them. I want to bring them back into the classroom and, bring them back into the community. That part's going to be really important. This is also really important if you just called your dean and say, hey, I got this kid that I need help with. You want to find a way after that dean talks to them to reintegrate them into the classroom. So maybe that dean got really good information and then you can ask them about it later. But it's really important that you do that circling back, because if just the dean got the information, right, you just took them out of the classroom and then the dean brought them back in, and there was no repair between teacher and student. And so that connection and that circling around is going to be really important, especially for kids who are traumatized and have difficulty building those relationships. In the past, they may have had adults not do that circling back, and that may have really harmed them. So I said we would talk next about that response. So we have some choices for effective response, and then we're going to get some guidelines, and then we're going to answer questions. So if you have some questions, whether it's on arc in action, or how do you cope in the classroom, or what are some self-care ideas, or how can I help this student that's really challenging me, make sure you're typing those into the question box on your control panel. So we'll go over the choices. So I have this kid who just pushed the desk. He's frustrated, right? I could choose a few things. I could choose to ignore or allow his behavior, right? He's on the way out of class. He didn't hurt anyone. You know, I might ignore it or allow it. I might be doing something else that was really important and I just can't get to him at that moment, right? This is fine if it's safe, right? However, this doesn't give us an opportunity for any learning, right? He may come back and do this again when he gets frustrated, whatnot. Our second option would be collaborate with them, right? If he's walking out of the classroom and I have a break, maybe I can call them back and say, you know what? Like, man, that was really frustrating. What were you frustrated about? And share your concern, and then we can kind of collaborate on a solution and say, you know, Lois, next time you're frustrated, how can I help you? And 9 times out of 10, when you ask kids for a solution, they have a really good one. And so oftentimes kids know that, or students know that, hey, like I got frustrated last time when I was in 8th grade and this is what my teacher did and it really helped. And you're like, great, let's try that next time. Perfect. Or sometimes I just need to go get a drink or go to the bathroom, but I don't have any passes left. Like, could I get a pass? Okay, great. Our next choice, so we have ignore or allow the youth behavior if it's safe. We can collaborate with them. And the last one is we can set limits. And I know teachers think about setting limits a lot. I think that these how-tos are really simple and clear ways that we can set limits. Ironically, it's also setting limits, you need to be simple and clear. Because our youth's brains might be flipped, if their lid might be flipped, we need to be simple and clear with them. They might not be taking in all the information. So Lewis, when you push the chair, you know, it's hurtful to the classroom, you might hurt someone. Next time when you walk out of the classroom, can you keep the chairs where they are? That's a limit, right? I could also give them a consequence if it was appropriate, right? But I want to make that consequence reasonable, enforceable, and individualized for them. I might say, you know, if you have this choice, you can walk out of the classroom slowly, or you can push the chair and there'll be this consequence. You know, there might be a conference or something like that. We want to make sure these are enforceable. When our lids are flipped, often we don't give enforceable consequences. We say, you're going to lose recess for the rest of the year. Well, that's not really that enforceable. That's really not individualized, and it's definitely not reasonable, right? So if we're giving unreasonable consequences, I think we need to think about our lids being flipped. So as we finish up, we're going to do guidelines, and then I'm going to get to those questions. So guidelines for effective response. I really like these. I've highlighted the ones I like. So do set limits, but don't get into a power struggle. I had a trainer one time tell me that a power struggle is like a kid giving you an invitation, saying, here, like, get into this struggle with me, let's go back and forth, right? Do not take the invitation. Be aware of your nonverbals and tone. So our kids who have been traumatized, since some of them may have experienced abuse, they can either see really small changes in your facial expression and in your tone, or they have trouble recognizing them at all. But if they can recognize them, just that small change in your voice or that small furrow of their brow, that might send them into fight, flight, or freeze mode. So be aware of those. The other one is don't use sarcasm. Sarcasm is about power, and when we're using sarcasm with a kid, we have to be really careful because we're expressing more that we're kind of making a joke on them and that we're in a position of power. And so just kind of reinstituting that, and that's really not helpful when we're trying to reconnect and reintegrate a student back into the classroom. So it looks like we have a few questions.
Yeah.
As we kind of finish up, actually I'll get to that. Yeah, we'll go with that now. So think about, do you have questions on impact of trauma on the brain, about effective response, and we'll go from there.
Right. I can take the first question that came in, and feel free, as Andrea said, to type in questions as you think of them. We have one asker. So what if we're giving examples of like, okay, you got this one challenging student. Now, what if you're a teacher, you have multiple students who are presenting with challenging behaviors in the classroom? And so when you have a classroom of 25 to 28 students, maybe more, yeah, it's likely that you are going to have more than one student with challenging behavior. So I had a little bit of time to think about this while Andrea was presenting. I think it's really important to set some of those routines and rituals in the classroom. So setting those classroom expectations, building those relationships early on in the year. This is why we're doing this webinar in September. You may think, oh, it's going to be a long year with these students. How is this ever going to turn around? It's not too late to reset those expectations in the classroom and to build those relationships with them, because that is what is going to really make a difference in the coming weeks and months as they are potentially continuing to present with some challenging behaviors, how you're responding to them, the consistency and that relationship you have with them is going to really make a difference. The other thing that I would recommend is to think about multi-tiered systems of support within the school. So if you are working with students who are presenting in that tier 2 area, having those challenging behaviors, maybe those students are also the ones presenting with some learning difficulties. Who else can you engage in the school to provide some support to you? It's possible that these students need some additional support outside of the classroom, whether that's some social emotional support or they need some accommodations or modifications to make their learning more succher. So, Andrea, if you have anything you'd want to add to that?
No, yeah, I think that was great. I think the other takeaways I would say is get to know these kids. Is choose a few, ask them what they like, ask them what they're interested, get to know their name. I know that's tough sometimes when you're teaching, if you're a high school teacher and you have a lot of kids getting to know, but being able to call them by their name, talking to parents, and getting to know their interests. And so you can use that in the classroom and use that to engage with them. And I think once those kind of tougher kids realize that you really care about them and you want them to do well, that can really help in the classroom. The other thing is it takes time. These kids are challenging, and it takes time to get to know them. It also takes time for them to improve. And so it's just being really patient with them and knowing that I'm going to plant some seeds today, and maybe next year those seeds are going to flower. But those are really important seeds that you're planting. So, keep doing that good work that you're doing. It looks like we have another question.
Yeah, so the other one is more of a housekeeping question. So we have 2 handouts that are already available to you. One is more about the admissions process at Mercy Home. The other is that ARC framework for educators. And we will be sharing those out with a follow-up email as well as with a PDF of our slides. So everything we've shared with you today will be available to you in a follow-up email. We hope to get that out to you on Monday, so keep an eye out for that. And the other thing that is really important for housekeeping is evaluation. So I'm going to share a link to our survey. It's a really quick survey. We'd love if you could answer it today if you have time, or we will also include that link in our follow-up email. But it's really important that we get your feedback to know what was helpful for you today, what are ways that we can improve, what are other topics that we can share with you in the future. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we do have some other webinar topics available, and some of those are a little bit more broad, so we can tailor it to your needs. We want to know, how we can be best resource to you.
Do we have a few more minutes? I think people are still on. We have a few more minutes. We commonly ask a question is about regulation tools in the classroom. So what do we use here at Mercy Home? What are some regulation tools that kids can use in the classroom? So if I was still teaching in the classroom, I would focus my regulation tools on the quiet ones. I'm holding this beanbag. This beanbag's really quiet. It's not going to bother other kids. Sometimes I've seen teachers put things underneath desks, like Velcro, and so kids can kind of like rub that. We've gotten kind of plasticky toys for kids. Anything that's going to be quiet and like kind of keep them to themselves. I've also seen some really cool classrooms recently with flexible seating, where some kids can choose to sit on a ball and kind of constantly kind of bounce. Other kids can choose to sit on these kind of little like kind of flat balloons, and they have like kind of spikes sticking up. They're plastic, but like, so when you sit on them, it kind of gives you some sensation. Or standing desks, right? I know if you work in an office space, a lot of adults have standing desks, and if we need to stand, like sometimes kids do too. So if you don't have standing desks, thinking about, okay, how can I let students move around my classroom to get to use some of that energy, and how can I individualize it for them? I've had responses to teachers, well, to that of like, well, if we let one kid do it, well, we have to let them all. Well, I think if you're honest with them and you really explain to kids why students have different needs and not everyone's Band-Aid goes on the same place, then they really understand. So it's, we're honest with them about what they need. And I think students will surprise us and be open to having a peer in the back of the classroom walking around, getting some energy out while they're sitting. So I would encourage you to really think about, how can I individualize and be honest with students about that individualization without losing the whole, without losing the whole crowd. So I think we're finishing up here.
Yes, we haven't had any other questions come in lately. So, like I said, we will send a follow-up email. If you have questions after that, you can include them either in your evaluation or respond to the email that we send out. Hope to get out on Monday. And tomorrow's Friday, so that's really exciting. We hope that you can take at least one thing from today's webinar and bring it into the classroom or bring it into the school environment with you tomorrow.
Yeah, thanks. Have a great night. Thanks for coming to our webinar. Bye.